On this episode of the Values and Interests podcast, I'm speaking with Peter Harris, Associate Professor at Colorado State University and author of the book Why America Can't Retrench and How It Might. Together, we discuss the cost of America's pursuit of military primacy following World War II, potential pathways to a less militarized future, and how the Trump administration has impacted America's engagement around the world. As always, be sure to subscribe to Carnegie Council on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. I hope you enjoy this episode. Welcome, Peter Harris, Associate Professor at Colorado State University. Thank you so much for joining the Values and Interests podcast.
Thank you for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Great. So, we have a lot to talk about. The geopolitics of the moment are not without, I feel like it's a deluge of news every time I turn on my phone in the morning. We also have to get to your book, which has been a great read, and we'll dig into that. But what we'd like to do on the Values and Interests podcast to start is really get a sense of our guests' own value system. We feel very strongly about this relationship between your value system and your profession. And then if you go up the ladder in terms of the people who are doing the work within the institutions, and you go up all the way to the state or the international level. So maybe we could start there and learn a little bit about your personal background, your own value system, and how that's informed your work right now.
Sure. So, personal background, I think something that's important to me is, where I come from. I come from the northwest of England, a town called Wigan, just outside of Manchester. I grew up there, and that's very important to me. I studied in the UK. My undergraduate degree was in Scotland, a master's degree in London. But then I moved to the US when I was 25 years old in 2010. My values, I think drawing on, my experience in the UK and now in the US, I describe myself as a liberal. I think I'm a classical liberal in many ways. Individual freedom, human flourishing, civil liberties are very, very important to me. And I think, I became a US citizen in 2018, and I take that quite seriously. I think this country, it sounds kind of cheesy to say this kind of stuff, but I think this country really is the best custodian of those classical liberal values, or can be.
Yeah.
They're challenged in the US frequently, right? The current moment is no exception. But there are people in the United States, and there are institutions in the United States, and there are political traditions in the United States that are great, and the world needs. I just did a semester at sea voyage this
I saw that.
spring.
I saw that on social. Yeah, very interesting.
Which was great, and it was fabulous. And you visit 10 countries, and they're all absolutely wonderful. But I think it's also okay to learn from a voyage like that how special America is. And it really is. And Americans, right? And the young people on that ship, mostly Americans, 550 young people traveling around the world, 10 different countries. So respectful, so polite, so curious, intellectually curious. And I came back energized, right? And I really kind of believe that kind of America's great. And it's great because of its ideals, right? And those kind of classical liberal ideals that they're quite important to me.
Yeah. No, I think it's good to return to that and the challenges of the current moment after we maybe get a baseline in terms of a little bit of what you've been working on the past few years from an IR perspective. So in 2024, you released the book Why America Can't Retrench and How It Might. So it'd be great to kind of hear your central thesis and argument for the book. And I'm very specific. I think my listeners will be very interested in this term retrenchment and kind of defining that and what that means.
So to me, retrenchment is a policy, right, of pulling back militarily. And I want to be clear about that. It's not about pulling back in other policy domains like the economy, diplomatic engagement, political leadership, that kind of stuff. It's very specifically referring to military forward deployments and military engagements. Retrenchment is a policy of reducing those and kind of pulling back militarily. It's a component, I should say, it's like a companion to restraint, which is a broader grand strategy of many different kind of policies packaged together. But so retrenchment is a piece of that, and it specifically refers to the pulling back of American forces militarily. And the thesis of the book is that America can't do that um, programmatically today. You get the odd instance, right? Biden's pull from Afghanistan being one kind of recent example, but there's no programmatic attempt to pull back American forces across the board, even though I argue the reason for those forces being deployed overseas has evaporated.
Yeah.
The context has changed dramatically over the past
Yeah.
80 years, and US domestic politics has changed dramatically. But for some reason, and I try and explain this in the book, America can't retrench anymore. So I wanted
Yeah.
to figure out why that's the
Yeah.
case.
No, very interesting. So, if we kind of look back the last 80 years, right, you have kind of the impetus for this militarization, which is World War II. And then you have kind of various geopolitical moments and conflicts, whether it's Cold War, Vietnam, War on Terror, right? So, what are you seeing right now kind of driving that primacy, military first status quo of this moment? And
Yeah.
maybe a little bit about that in terms of kind of current trends.
I argue it's a product of path dependence. So as you rightly say, the World War II era and the Cold War era, it was overdetermined that the United States would be militarily engaged abroad, right? I mean, Japan attacked the United States, right,
Yeah.
at Pearl Harbor, and kind of forced the hand of the United States to enter World War II. So it was overdetermined that we would send
Yeah.
the U.S. Armed Forces into the Asia Pacific and into Europe, and then stay there in the Cold War,
Mm.
in the to contain the Soviet Union. Those policies are understandable, right? But the Axis were defeated in 1945 and the Soviet Union ceased to exist in 1991. So why are we still there? And my argument is that 40-year stretch from 1940 or 50-year stretch from 1941 to 1991, it changed the United States. It kind of required US leaders to build an American state much different from what had existed before. A big permanent standing military, a national security apparatus, a strengthened executive branch. We rewired the political economy of the United States with the arms industry being kind of distributed across the country. And over the course of that 50-year period, America changed, and it had to change. It had to change into a country that could support this massive globe-spanning military strategy of military primacy by
Mm.
necessity, right? The country had to change to support that. And we still have that though, right? We still have the state that was built in the 40s and the 50s and the 60s all the way through, right, the Reagan era. We still have that state today, and that
Mm.
state cannot retrench. It wasn't built to
Yeah.
retrench. It was built to run the world. And you can put whoever you want in the White House, and they will have a very difficult time retrenching because of the helm of a state that was not built to do that.
Mm. You know, if we're thinking about kind of, I guess, trends in this moment, right, or the expansion of the military industrial complex to the techno military industrial complex. So we're seeing a lot of trends right now in terms of that system basically being integrated in a very aggressive way into the new driver of the US economy, which is tech. And you're seeing all this money flow from VC into AI companies that are then entered into a basically cyclical relationship with the US government through a massive defense contract. So that is something that I've talked a lot about on the podcast in terms of maybe the opposite of retrenchment, but technologically doubling down in this new arms race. So in terms of your argument in the book is, this political status quo and what potential ways forward to, I guess, retrench responsibly. Is that a trend you're seeing that is really throwing a wrench into the potential to do that right now, or do you have another view on it?
I think, you know, there's just no political incentive to retrench, right? I
Mm.
mean, the military budget has become a way of doing all kinds of things in the US, achieving all kinds of policy goals. Michael Brannis has got this great book on the military industrial complex, and he shows how in the Cold War, both political parties used it as a pseudo kind of welfare state, right? It was a way to kind of give to communities. And today it's being used as a way to drive industrial policy. I'm not against it's a kind of a smart industrial policy and kind of on semiconductors or AI or whatever it might be. I mean, I think the federal government is reasonable, right, to expect they would have a role in kind of industrial policy. But I don't think the defense budget is the best kind of vessel for that. But that's really the only tool, one of the main tools that US policymakers have got at their disposal. I mean, the Biden administration, when they were trying to sell to a skeptical public and a skeptical Congress, um, aid to Ukraine, they tried all kinds of reasons, right? And the public and the Senate was kind of, we
Yeah,
might want to place a limit on this. And eventually, the mask just kind of slipped, and they just said, look, we authorize this spending because it's good for the states, right? It's going to create this many jobs in Texas, this many jobs in California. And that is not the basis upon which you should be making foreign policy, right?
yeah,
Job creation in states. But that it kind of has become like
yeah.
the reason we have this massive military establishment is for to serve domestic priorities, and that's wrong. We should divorce this. I think it's
Mhm.
reasonable to go to the Senate and say, do you want to do you want to fund a job creations package? Do you want to fund, AI and tech companies and some kind of incentive so we can become a powerhouse? That's reasonable, but don't do it through the defense budget because it kind of it confuses people, and it in fact is quite dangerous because all of that kind of stuff goes into a forward deployed military posture that I think is actually getting quite dangerous for the United States in the current context.
Yeah. And historically, there has been this tension between congressional authority in matters of foreign policy and the executive. But I don't know, maybe you can talk a little, I don't want to give my own opinion because you're the guest, but maybe talk a little bit about kind of how you're seeing that relationship right now. And kind of what's that driving in terms of foreign policy decisions and then also investments of budget into foreign policy and defense spaces.
Yeah, I mean, DC is very polarized, obviously, and we're in an era of kind of hyper partisanship, which isn't unprecedented in America, but it's that's what we have at the moment. Um, so in that context, Congress is it's not quite as jealous of its constitutional prerogatives as I think it probably should be. Um, and the the party in power, the party that controls the White House at the moment, the Republicans, are kind of usually able to count on their co-partisans in Congress to get whatever they want through, and that's a bad thing. And I think in the book, what I argue is I don't know how you can get to a more balanced uh, executive legislative relationship without changing the party system. And people can when I discuss the book with people, this is one area where they say it's ridiculous. That'll never happen, right? The two-party system is here to stay. And I just don't accept that from from a comparative politics perspective, it's not the case that our electoral system has to produce two parties. There's plenty of where I come from in the UK, we have a first past the post electoral system, but it's a multi-party system. The US used to have a People's Party, right? The Populist Party that elected people to Congress. And in fact, like elected state governors. It's possible. And it's possible for the voters in states like Colorado, where I am, in California, to take control away from parties
Yeah.
in state referendums and stuff like that. To change kind of voting laws without the parties kind of agreeing to that. So I think you probably do need that though. Like the Democrats and the Republicans today, I think it's really a broken
Yeah.
system of electoral representation that we've got. And if we want, I think the Constitution is great, right? The Constitution is set up in a way that should um, incentivize legislators to hold the executive branch to account, but the parties are broken, and that's where the focus really needs
Yeah.
to be.
Well, we're not going to solve political polarization on this conversation, so we don't need to go down
No.
that rabbit hole. There's more than enough podcasts on that. I think just to comment on, the possibility of a two-party shift and some change there. So I think my biggest blind spot, really, that I've had to kind of take a step back is growing up in the 1990s, where you just assumed there was this system, right? From
Yeah.
a geopolitical perspective, from a US values perspective, from a political perspective. I think what the last few years and the last 8 months has definitely shocked a lot of people and shown me is that the norms change, right? There is
Yeah,
not that might have been a bit of a vacation for a while, and
yeah,
we are in a new world. So that also that creates a lot of issues potentially for liberal values, but it also creates a lot of opportunity for people who want to lean into the issue and not just be reactive and think about putting out fires, but think about wanting to put a new vision forward.
yeah.
So yeah, no, it's an interesting awakening in the last few years, I would say the least.
Yeah, I think we're living through a moment where, yeah, political change is really possible. You know, in political science they talk about these punctuated equilibrium moments where things are kind of the same, but then boom, they kind of change rapidly.
Yeah,
And that's happened before in US history. Usually you need some kind of shock, external shock to kind of catalyze that. I mean, I hope we don't have one of those, right? A war or some kind of international crisis. But I think it's right. The current moment is one where change is possible, and that's we shouldn't fear change necessarily. I think the US does need to change. Certainly, it needs to change its foreign policy, and it's good that there's people trying to change the conversation on that. And even in the administration, I think people inside the administration, some of the things they say are useful in terms of moving the United States in a better direction.
yeah,
Um, so yeah, there's definitely room for optimism.
yeah. Yeah, well, I think just on the side, I would have been disappointed if the International Relations IR scholarship term was anything less than punctuated equilibrium. So, there we go. We'll add it to the
Yeah,
list of of very long, very long,
yeah, nice and accessible.
winded
Yeah,
terms.
yeah,
So I wanted to kind of take a step back. So a big portion of the book is really kind of thinking about these different waves of kind of the different types of how the US has engaged or not engaged with the world, starting around the 1860s and kind of going up through present day. And you always hear this reference in terms of Eisenhower's farewell speech and kind of where
yeah.
he not so subtly talks about the dangers of the military industrial complex. And so earlier on in our conversation, you were talking about kind of the need, the necessity, I guess, in kind of responding to Japan and then having this near peer adversary in kind of the Cold War years. Can we talk I know you don't have a crystal ball, but can we talk a little bit about, if you're going back in time and say we follow the advice there, what does that bring for America? And also what maybe new risks would have that created if we didn't expand the system, the military
Hmm.
primacy system so much?
That's a fascinating counterfactual to think through, and I haven't really done it properly myself, so I'm kind of thinking on my feet here. But
That's great.
you know,
Conversations.
yeah,
That's
let's
like
see. I mean, so let's think about it, right? Eisenhower gives his farewell address. He warns about this creeping military industrial complex. And let's say that, the JFK comes in and he's convinced by that. Yeah, so you retrench a little bit, right? So what could have happened? And I'll say, 10 years later, Richard Nixon kind of adopt some of that kind of thinking. You would shift more into the allies, right? You'd say to the Western Europeans and to the Japanese, you need to continue to spend on defense or maybe spend more and come up with some kind of credible way that you can promise to defend each other because you can't count on the United States to intervene. Um, we could have relied more on nuclear weapons to deter the Soviet Union from attacking the United States. We were very secure during the Cold War, right? It was our allies that were vulnerable. So we could have relied on nuclear weapons to keep us safe, which I mean Eisenhower wanted to invest in nukes and kind of reduce spending on conventional
Hmm,
military
interesting.
forces.
Interesting. I didn't know that. Huh.
Yeah. Um, and I think the country, economically, it's hard to really the counterfactual was always really difficult, right? But
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
economically, we could have been without a lot of people talk about military spending, and I'm kind of in this camp as a drag on economic growth. Like you get some kind of returns from investing in the military, but not as much as if you would just let the private sector invest that. So these kind of like these moments in the 60s when at the height of Vietnam, we're spending like 10% of GDP,
Yeah, it's huge.
close to that on the military. the economy was probably being held back, right? And we could have been racing ahead technologically, racing ahead economically if we would have been doing less overseas. And who knows, maybe you see the Cold War ending earlier because of the American model of kind of free enterprise would have been um, allowed to kind of do its thing. What you would have also seen, though, you would have had less of this state building that I talk about in the book. The country would have been less kind of like hardwired towards military and primacy. So when the Cold War did end, when the Soviet Union did collapse, the country could have conceivably been in a position to kind of like return to normalcy like it did after World War One. We never did that after the Cold War. We never just kind of became a normal country again. And maybe if we would have followed Eisenhower's advice, we would have. And me and you growing up in the 90s, we would have had a different experience where the system we
Yeah.
witnessed was just totally different. I don't know.
Yeah. No, no, no. It's really interesting to think about. That's why we have these conversations, so we can think about them. We have a forum to think
Yeah.
about them. So there's a short chapter in the book, and I'm very remiss not to bring this up from the Carnegie Council perspective, where you talk about
Mm.
quote unquote moral movements.
Yeah.
It's an area that I've been very interested in, post World War II in the U.S. and you know I think about it from this Reinhold Niebuhr, Hans Morgenthau, Joe Nye perspective, and kind of this spectrum between naive idealism and kind of amoral realism. And the fact that, not the fact, the opinion that the good
Hmm.
statesperson has to kind of understand those two poles exist and attempt to operate within it in a
Yeah.
pragmatic way, especially from a liberal society perspective. And so maybe you could talk about kind of the waves post World War II of kind of these moral movements and how they've influenced this primacy, right? So
Yeah. Yeah.
different morals, different value sets, but they kind of still were all going in a similar direction, which is needed to be underpinned by this military primacy. So maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I guess what that part of the book, what I'm trying to make clear is this grand strategy of primacy, it's like addiction, as I think of it, to military spending. It's not just because of the economics of this, like the we raise $1 trillion a year in taxes or borrow and then we give it out. It's not just that. It's that there's this intellectual edifice or a set of edifices that have like been constructed around it. As you say, moral movements, idealists, people who want the world to be a better place from their view, have kind of latched on to American primacy and tried to use it to further their own agenda. So you had the anti-communists, right, during the Cold War, liberal internationalists who kind of want to globalize human rights and universal human rights. They make a bargain with the U.S. state. There's a great book on this by Stephen Hopgood called the End Times of Human Rights. It's about 10 years old now, but he kind of chronicles how in the 70s, right, the human rights movement, it kind of made a bargain with the US government as a way to spread liberal ideals
Hmm.
and the idea of universal human rights. And look, I believe in universal human rights. I believe in the dignity of the individual all across the planet. But I think that when the US government is using this kind of military to advance those kind of ideals, you can get counterproductive uh, outcomes. So yeah, I mean, I guess we found ourselves in a place, let's say in the 90s, and probably still today, where US politicians, when they're faced with this kind of implicit choice, continue this kind of path of primacy, the well-beaten path of primacy, or try something different and retrench, they have to think, well, if I do this, like who will I offend and who will punish me? Like what sticks am I going to be beaten with? And some of it's the economic stuff, but a lot of it is kind of people say, well, you're selling out human rights, you're selling out American ideals. This is anti-American of you. This is nationalistic, kind of little America, kind of petty national. There's a way you get beaten with these idealist sticks that people don't want to go there. And
Yeah.
the withdrawal from Afghanistan was like that, even before um, the fall of Kabul, right? When it was just kind of announced that we were going to pull people out. The op-eds was just it was just an avalanche of op-eds that you just consigning Afghan women and girls to a life of torture. This is like an abomination. It's, an abandonment of American ideals. You shouldn't be doing this from the left and from the right. And again, I believe in gender equality. Of course I do. Of course we want Afghan women and girls to have equal rights. Um, but I don't know if the war could have continued uh, for much longer. I don't think the US presidents could have stayed there for much longer. And
Yeah.
Biden was just hammered. He was hammered because he seems to violate this ideal, right? This kind of
Mm.
these sets of values. And it's just another stumbling block to retrenchment because there's kind of these camps, ideological camps in the United States that have this kind of association now with primacy.
Yeah. Great. So very, very interesting. And I think that, a lot of times the great part about kind of focusing on applied ethics here at the council is that it gives a framework to interrogate those difficult trade-offs that you just talked
Yeah.
about, right? So you can do that from a non-political, non-economic position and really just, talk about it from both from an individual's values perspective, but also an institution or a state. So, it's very helpful in our own work here to kind of have that toolkit. You talked about kind of the pressures against retrenchment, and in the book, and please correct me if I'm misstating here, but in the book, you make a very clear demarcation point between retrenchment and isolationism, and kind of one of the prescriptions you offer is less military, but more of this multilateral, good faith, honest engagement, right? And from the council's perspective, we think about that as like civic forums, safe forums, multilateral forums to deal with these differences in values, right? And kind of
Yeah.
like not have the end result be another world war, right? In the most like basic way possible. So my question to you is that in the last 8 months, we have seen just this is empirical, right? The pullout and defunding of
Hmm.
multilateral institutions as well as soft power institutions at home. So, what is your kind of analysis of the health of that potential prescription right now and kind of
Yeah.
leaning in? And it'd be great to get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the administration is doing about as perfectly the opposite of what I recommended as it would be possible to do. I wrote in the first Trump administration that he was the wrong sort of anti-internationalist, and I think that's still the case, right? So I think what America needs to do for its own security, and so that it can pursue domestic renewal and for the benefit of others overseas, is to militarily retrench. We have the opposite, right? There's not really noticed it. Well, maybe some signs, but right now, over the past 8 months, no real discernible move towards retrenchment. Quite the opposite with bombing Iran and whatnot. And as you say, at the same time, the pulling away from free trade, pulling away from multilateral institutions. I don't know what I mean. I don't. It is inviting some pushback domestically, some
Yeah,
right, but I don't know if it's enough for the pendulum to really swing in the other direction
yeah,
when Trump is replaced by somebody else, either another Republican or a
yeah,
Democrat. But
yeah.
from my perspective, it's the wrong recipe, right?
Mm,
The United States will flourish and it will prosper and it will be secure if it engages in the world in a really confident way,
yeah,
economically, politically, diplomatically. And when we talk about soft power, I still think it's the case that this country has just got the biggest, and quite rightly, like the biggest reserve of soft power of any country in the world. A lot of people around the world want to be like the United States. They want to be Americans. They're willing to swim across oceans, right, to come to the United States. No one's doing that to get to Russia, right, or to China or to our
yeah,
geopolitical adversaries. And it's really short-sighted to be, as you
yeah.
say, kind of chipping away at the institutions that give us that soft power.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting to watch over the next year or two kind of public opinion polls. And obviously, as we know in the IR space, soft power is almost a joke, right? It's very hard to
Yeah,
measure, and everyone's got an opinion when somebody tries to measure it. So, but I think at the basic, favorability polls, especially in Western European countries, will be very interesting from kind of traditional transatlantic allies to see
yeah,
what comes out of that data in the coming months and years.
yeah.
Yeah, it'll be very interesting.
I think I mean, it's true in IR, in the academy, especially among kind of self-described realists, many of whom, were close friends of mine. The idea of soft power is often ridiculed, and I'm not in that camp, right? I think soft power is real. It's hard to measure, of course it is, but I think we know it when we see it, right? Political and cultural attractiveness. Of course, countries vary along that dimension. Some are more culturally attractive than others. I mean, of course. And it's to me, it's just manifestly obvious that the US, its cultural and political soft power, is enormous, no matter who's in the White House. And
Yeah.
again, I mean, I just to refer to my recent experience on semester at sea, I don't know how many other countries in the world but you could load up a cruise ship with like 550 18 to 22-year-olds and send them around the world, and they would be well received to the degree that I saw those American students to be
That's good.
received. People love America around the world. They really do, and they love what it stands for. Of course, they have issues with the US government of the day, like whoever's in charge, but American cultural power and the attractiveness of its constitution and its institutions, it's strong. I think it's stronger than ever, and we can lean into that. We could harness that to change the world for the better. I don't think we are doing, but we could kind of harness that stuff better than we currently do.
So one of the things I'm really interested in, which is kind of relational to soft power, you talk about it in the book, are kind of the narratives and the power of narratives that are being projected, both from, we talked before we jumped on here about kind of, you know, a little bit about what's going on in the ecosystem, but, you know, I think the narrative power that is going on right now versus policy, right? And
Yeah,
how people prioritize decision making on narratives versus policy, right? I think that dynamic
yeah,
has changed significantly, and it's going to change, I would say, a lot more as the we get more siloed and people kind of
yeah.
pick their LLM universe and the internet goes the way or the web browser goes the way of the dodo to a certain extent. So be interesting to watch, but again, going back to kind of your prescription for primacy, there's a very like literal narrative occurrence in the past few weeks in terms of the Trump administration turning the Department of Defense into the Department of War. And Secretary Hegseth's in the Oval Office, and he gives this kind of justification for doing so. And the line he gives is, the department is going to focus on maximum lethality, not tepid legality, and violent effect, not politically correct. Now, there has been a lot that's come out in the last 8 months, but those few words I thought captured the view of the administration on multilateral institutions, kind of those shackles or the moral shackles that they've seen around things like international law. So I wanted to get your reaction to that in
Yeah.
terms of, again, the visceral change of defense to war and kind of how that impacts your view moving forward and kind of this primacy point.
Yeah, so that kind of hawkish, kind of nationalistic take will appeal to a lot of Americans, right? That there's a constituency for that kind of narrative who will lap it up. But I think for people like me on the kind of restraint side of things, I think it also presents an opportunity to, let's call it what it is, war, right? The Department of Defense, in fact, right, doesn't spend like the $1 trillion a year that it now gets on strict national defense. That's not what's taking place. Like it is war. Let's call it that.
Very
So I
fair,
think
yeah.
there's going to be constituencies in the United States that could be kind of activated, or this could be explained to them. Well, do you want to spend $1 trillion on war? Do you want to spend $1 trillion on maximum lethality? And I think, the Democrats, because they're the party out of power, but also people within the Republican Party and people in this wider civil society restraint movement should take this as an opportunity to say, no, thank you. We're calling it what it is, right? We're funding a war machine, and maybe we should spend less on that. I mean, in the book, I cite an analysis by Ben Friedman and Justin Logan. It's been about a decade ago now, but they were looking at like how much money would we save if we retrenched kind of from kind of overseas military bases in a really significant way. And I just kind of updated their figures for inflation. And it's about something like 130 billion a year you could save just by kind of cutting back on the
Yeah.
overseas stuff. And that's enough to extend child tax credits that we had during the COVID pandemic and basically lift almost every American child
Mm.
out of poverty. So I think you can say to the American, I mean, if you're a politician worth your salt, do you want to fund war or do you want to lift children out of poverty? And that's an easier, that's a starker contrast than defense and child poverty. Because of course we all agree that national defense is really important, but war, right? Rhetorically, I think this could end up being kind of an own goal.
Yeah, yeah, no, very interesting point. It kind of gives moral clarity to
Yeah,
something that, might have been seen originally as kind of a tactical stick your chest out moment. So
sure.
yeah, very, very interesting. Good. So, this has been a really great discussion. I wanted to end kind of with the opportunity to, especially in the current moment, looking back at the book and kind of maybe some of your future work, what was kind of the one thing that I didn't touch on, but you wish maybe I had asked, and we can kind of close on that.
Well, I think, I've been thinking a lot. I wrote the book under the Biden administration, and I didn't expect that Trump would be reelected, to be totally honest. But he was reelected, and he's done some things that, it kind of, some things are really inconsistent, obviously, with what I kind of argued for, and we talked about those. But some things are kind of consistent, in a way, and it's things that I have to kind of grapple with, like the defunding of the Wilson Center and the United States Institute for Peace. Like I called for not a defunding of those institutions, but a more pluralistic kind of
Mm,
landscape in the
yeah,
think
yeah,
tank world. Now, I would have preferred for them to not be defunded, but maybe like an instruction
yeah,
to become more pluralistic, whatever.
yeah,
But there's definitely been a move towards um, changing the conversation on national security and foreign policy away from how do we run the world, which I think it's been for about 80 years, to like how do we serve our national interests. And I think it's very kind of crass, right? The way that the administration talks about some of these things, it can be kind of blunt, but it's not wrong, right? Like there's some kind of justification for it. I mean, the idea that overseas conflicts are kind of not our fight, it's the kind of thing that people hear, it's kind of crass. It kind of sounds like, oh, you're kind of abandoning allies. It doesn't sound very American. But for decades, there hasn't been a limiting principle on what America's fights are. Right? Where does America's national interest end? It's been, I say this in the book, it's been almost entirely conflated with international stability. Like
mm,
America, Madeleine Albright had this, the indispensable nation. It's because we see farther than others. And it's almost like we saw so far that we saw America's national interest in every single corner of the world, in every conflict had to do with US national security. And at least the administration is kind of starting a conversation on what is a limiting principle. Where does America's national security end? Where does the defensive perimeter end? And you can disagree with them on the language they use, and we could all have different answers to that question. But we do have to have that conversation, and
yeah, yeah,
I'm glad they're having it, and I'm glad
yeah,
that like domestically, again, like I think the way they handled kind of the Wilson Center and USIP and it was I think very badly handled, and I want to be clear about that. But we do need a more pluralistic conversation in Washington, D.C. And I'm not sure the administration is
yeah,
kind of moving us in that direction, but maybe what comes next, we all need to think about how we
yeah,
can do
yeah,
that more responsibly. So
yeah.
that's what I would say. Yeah.
No, very, very helpful. I think it's important to kind of push on these things where multiple things can be true at once, right? Like there is value in systems changing or they die, right? There is value in having more of a pluralistic conversation around foreign policy, but that can be done in one manner or it can be done as a bull in the china shop, right? So I
Sure.
think
Yeah.
it's important. It's important to hold multiple truths at once. And I will go back to the old selfish plug that ethics is very helpful in kind of removing it from a political frame and thinking about it in that way and applying it. So
Yeah.
you've given me a lot to think about based on this conversation. So I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for joining us.
No, thank you. The pleasure is mine, and I'm really just thrilled to be invited on. So thank you.